All right, so welcome back. Let's get started with elements of effective teaching that include risk management and accident prevention. So we're getting into some of this accident prevention stuff, and we're going into that process of understanding where the risks come from and what can potentially be a risk for us as pilots. And how do we mitigate that risk? So how do we keep that risk down to a minimum? So let's get started. So risk management, when we talk about risk management, it's a decision-making process, and it's really designed to identify the hazards. We want to assess the degree of risk, and then we want to determine the best course of action. So let's identify it. What is it? Name it. Okay, name it. We want to assess it. What is it? What's going to happen? What is potentially going to happen? Is it a high risk that it's going to happen or a low risk that it's going to happen? Is what is happening a catastrophic, dangerous situation, or is it a low risk situation? And then what is the course of action? What do we do? What do we take in response to it? If we're flying and we see that a light has gone out on our wing or something, do we have to declare an emergency and land? Probably not, right? So, that would be an overreaction to a situation. However, if we're flying and all of a sudden we have fouling spark plugs and the engine is running super rough and we're not really 100% sure if it's fouling spark plugs, we're not really sure what it is, but we just know that the engine is running really rough. Now that's a different story. We might need to get into a situation where we're declaring an emergency and landing at the nearest airport. So, understanding the differences between those two. This should be taught from day one. We want to make sure that we're teaching this risk management really from day one with that pilot. Understanding with that student pilot, teaching that student pilot that when they're doing the pre-flight inspection, what is it that they're doing during that pre-flight inspection and what is their thought process? Are they looking at through the lens or their paradigm of I'm challenging this aircraft because I want to make sure that it's safe? Or is their paradigm, I really want to make sure that I'm going on this flight because I'm really excited to fly today and I don't want to miss this flight if something comes up amiss with this airplane? Because potentially, if that's their paradigm, they can overlook something, and that would then be a danger to the flight or to us as the pilot. So make sure that that student pilot is operating with the correct paradigm and understanding risk management from day one. Because typically speaking, once you teach them how to do that pre-flight, you're going to have them pre-flight the airplane. And even though you as the CFI are going to kind of follow up and give them a secondary pre-flight, they're expected to really do that primary pre-flight after they've learned how to do it. So make sure that when they're doing the pre-flight, they're using the right lenses to look at that airplane. So what are potential risk management? You have the hazard. It's a real or perceived risk. Is that risk a real risk or is it something that perceives as a risk? A new pilot is going to perceive almost everything as a risk because they don't understand the whole process. They are having a difficult time. It may be they're task saturated already, in the flight environment, and they just feel that everything is a risk. Or is it just a perceived risk, right? Or is it an actual risk that's occurring through that flight? Risk, possible future impact, probability, and severity. We're going to talk about that with one of our risk management tools, our FRAT tools, and it's going to identify the difference between the probability of a risk and the severity of the risk. These are important things. Safety is really about the freedom from risk, danger, or damage to property. All flights, all aviation activities have a certain level of risk, but we want to mitigate or diminish that risk as much as possible and maintain a safe environment in order to be free from those specific risks, dangers, and damaging of property. All right, so let's talk about the type of risks. So there's several different types of risks. You have the total risk, you have the identified risks, you have unidentified risks, you have unacceptable risks, you have the unacceptable, those are in red. You have the acceptable risk, those are in green, and then you have residual risk. So let's go ahead and first talk about the total risk. That's the sum of both the identified and unidentified risks. Okay, so you're doing your pre-flight. Maybe you're planning your cross country, and you notice that you're going to have to go up, and you're going to have to go through kind of a canyon pass. That's a risk. You're like, if the winds are doing something, or if we don't like the way the conditions are, like we understand that risk, and we've kind of identified it and saw it in the back of our mind as being a challenge during that cross country. But the unidentified risks are things that, like a rapid change in weather, or something that would happen to our aircraft during the flight. Those are unidentified risks. You have, so we talked about the identified risks, and then the unidentified risks. Those are the two different things. And then you have the unacceptable risk, right? And that unacceptable risk are things like inappropriate behavior by either a pilot or a instructor. One of the most, recently there was a well-documented, unfortunately it was well-documented, action of a CFI who was in the midst of a night flight with a private pilot student, and was not live streaming, but he was, I don't know, he was tweeting, or he was using social media to basically make inappropriate comments about his student throughout the entire flight. And he was not paying attention to what was happening. It was very disrespectful to both the flight school, and to his student. And this resulted in their inadvertent flying into a severe thunderstorm that resulted in a catastrophic loss of both the aircraft and life. So, that's unacceptable behavior when it comes to a flight instructor, and just making sure that that is controlled. You have the acceptable risks, and those acceptable risks are identifying risks that are allowed without further management or actions. So we understand that these are specific risks, but we don't need to provide any additional management. The decision is made with full knowledge that it is the user who is exposed. So if it's a situation where something is inoperative in the airplane, it's not needed in the kinds of operation list. It's not needed in our tomato flames. And so we identify that risk is not going to cause a operational condition or concern with us during the flight. Even though it's a certain level of risk, we're going to go ahead and accept that level of risk and continue with the flight. And then you have the residual risks. Those are left over after system safety efforts have been fully employed. So, these are things that we've already taken all of the appropriate measures to mitigate. However, there's still a certain level of risk. So, like I said, we have that mountain canyon. We are going to fly through it. We have identified that in our cross country, that mountain canyon is going to present a certain level of risk. We know the weather. We've done a weather briefing prior to getting there. However, there could be a residual risk there if the weather or the winds change. That can be a consideration. But as long as we leave ourselves with a way out of that situation, that residual risk can be mitigated. So let's go ahead and talk about the principles of risk mitigation. And this first one that we're going to talk about is accepting no unnecessary risks. So understanding the difference between the cost and the benefit. And so the cost versus the benefit, do not accept risks which provide no benefit at all. So you're in a situation, let's say you're up at Big Bear, it's 7,000 feet, the density altitude is like 15 or 14,000 feet, and you're really concerned. You've ran the numbers, and it's a late afternoon, and it's really hot. It's in the summer, and you're not really sure about the takeoff distance. You're just a little bit concerned because you have a couple extra bags in the back, but you can see that if you take off in the morning, tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock in the morning when it's nice and cool, then there's going to be no issues there regarding your density altitude. So, what's the benefit? Well, you can get home tomorrow and you still, you don't have any work. So there's really no benefit to taking off in the afternoon and risking, going into Big Bear Lake to try to catch some trout. There's really no reason to go into Big Bear Lake. So let's just wait till tomorrow. We'll find a cheap place to stay, and we'll take off in the morning when it's nice and cool and our density altitude is not so high. So that would be accepting no unnecessary risks. Making risk decisions at the appropriate level. You can see there I have the Challenger disaster. Really, after all of the research and, one of the evaluators of that was Brigadier General Charles Yeager, and he publicly made it very public that due to the PR movement, the appropriate level, making decisions at the appropriate level, the flight crew and the pilot were kind of edged out of the go no go decision, and they really should have been involved with that decision. And that was his strong beliefs as a contributing factor to that accident. So making appropriate decisions, those pilots on that Challenger should have been way more involved in that go no go decision, and it resulted in disaster because the PR issue was with the teacher that was going to be flying in that Challenger. So obviously it was a terrible travesty for the NASA program. We want to make risks when benefits outweigh the cost. It's impossible to completely eliminate risk. We understand that, but we want to make sure that it outweighs the cost. So making sure that where benefits are, is doing this flight worth it, right? And then integrate risk management into a plan of all levels during flight planning and during pre-flight and even during post-flight. So risk management should be at all levels. When I'm doing volunteer work with the cadets, I first want to make sure that I myself am ready and I'm free of any like illnesses and I'm well rested. Is the aircraft ready? We're doing that days before. The cadets that I'm flying with, are they wanting to go flying or are they being forced to go flying by their parents, right? Want to make sure that it's something that they want to do. So making sure my pilot and my passengers are ready to go as well. And then just making sure that all the way through, all the way till the end, even after I fly, going around and doing my post-flight inspection of the aircraft. So I'm not leaving the airplane, in a condition that another pilot could not fly it in or be disappointed when they come out to the airport. So doing my post-flight inspection as well. So integrated in every level. So this is another tool in order to identify risk management process. This tool is a great one. Not every box is going to be utilized every time, but if we go through the process, it's really good. So we identify the hazards, assess the risk. We want to analyze control, make controlled decisions, use control, and monitor the results. So the analogy we're going to be using for this system is going to be a flight that is at, let's say, 6,500 feet over Riverside, and the spark plugs are beginning to foul on the airplane. Maybe there's been a lot of students have been using that airplane. They haven't been leaning out the mixture, and so those spark plugs are filled with carbon. So some things that are going to happen, that engine's going to start running really rough. Even though you think that it is a foul spark plug situation, you're not 100% sure. You just know that you're starting to lose engine power and the engine is running really rough. So how are we going to proceed with this? So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify the hazard. What is the hazard? We're going to brainstorm, right? We're going to think, okay, what's happening? Our airplane is making a lot of noise. It's losing power. And so we want to brainstorm, use some experience as a guide. So what's my experience? Well, shoot, I've experienced this before. What can go wrong? So can the engine completely stop and seize? I'm taking power out and I'm not getting anything back. So I'm not getting additional power back. What if this airplane engine completely quits on me? And then identify manageable elements. So what are things that I can manage in regards to this situation? So we're identifying the hazard first. This is the hazard. We're naming it and we're identifying it. The next thing is we're going to prioritize risks and identify identified hazards. So probability of occurrence, well, it's already happening. The probability of the airplane completely quitting, I'm not 100% sure, but if it's running rough, then the probability can be potentially high. Frequency of exposure, the exposure is already occurring, and it's getting, let's say, it might be getting worse. The severity of possible loss. So if we lose this engine, what is the severity? Am I directly over an airport? Am I in gliding distance of an airport? Or do I have a safe landing spot somewhere nearby? We want to analyze the risk. So we consider the risk, control options to eliminate the risk. What are some things that we could eliminate this risk? We might troubleshoot it a little bit by leaning the mixture, maybe troubleshooting some other things, but we're basically heading towards an airport. Reduce the ability of occurrence. It is already occurring. And then reduce the severity of loss. So we're heading towards an airport, and we could even declare an emergency to get priority. Make control decisions. We want to choose appropriate risk control options, decide the control application and procedure, and then select an alternate option. So if we are making an attempt to go towards that runway, we're trying to get towards that runway and identify it, and then we're making that decision to move in that direction. So we're trying to make that option to make the control decisions, and we're getting towards that runway, towards that safe place. The control options, engineering, technology, operational procedures, administrative measures, physical tools, educational awareness, and personal protective equipment. Like I said, not all of these are going to fit into the scenario, but basically operational procedures, declare an emergency, right? That's an operational procedure. You're going to receive priority, and you're going to also receive extra help from a controller. If that's an option they can provide you, that's great. So you want to make sure that you have that available for you. And then obviously any emergency equipment being dispatched to where you're at if necessary. And then we want to supervise and review what is our actions and are they in the right direction, right? So we've identified that we're going to, let's say, we were over we were near French Valley Airport, so we are now going to turn in towards French Valley, and we're nice and high, so even if we lose complete power, we can still glide there. Or are we starting to have more engine loss, and we don't want to leave a certain area that has a good landing spot? So we want to make sure we review what we're doing. So make sure we're reviewing that process as we're going along. So constantly reviewing in that risk process. So review the process as we're moving through this emergency. So like I said, not all of these are always going to fit in this risk management process. So just understand that, but in every scenario, but understand this process from start to finish. This could be something that would be a pre-flight, or it could be in-flight situation. So either way, you're going to go through this process and identify the risks. So this chart here is really nice. I really like the way this chart is set up. We're talking about the level of risks, severity, and probability. So when we talk about a probability that has it's a probable situation. So it's probable that it will happen, but it's negligible. So negligible meaning really not that complicated, or not that not that dangerous, right? So it's negligible. This may be considered a medium risk, but something that's probable and it's marginal, so the risk is marginal, right? That might be considered a serious risk, because that marginal condition might overwhelm the pilot, and then it will then move into the serious condition. So making sure we understand that a probable situation that's marginal can potentially be very dangerous for the flight. So just keep that into mind. A probable and negligible situation, what would be an example of that? That would be something like, you have a light out, you have landing lights out, but it's daytime, right? You go to fly and your landing lights are out, but it's a daytime operations. And you notice that those landing lights are out in flight. Do you need to make an emergency landing because your landing light is out during the daytime VFR? No. So, and then you have the cost versus benefit. We already really discussed that, but just kind of discussing it in this, a situation that's probable and catastrophic, or even occasional or remote and catastrophic, like we don't want to mess around with that at all. But like we said, if it's a negligible situation and there's a remote or occasional occurrence, then that's pretty low, and we might be able to mitigate that danger. So just kind of looking at this process as a whole and understanding how we mitigate through this is a good idea. We can also use this when we identify an inoperative equipment that is not on any of the lists, right? It's not in our kinds of operation list. It's not an airworthiness directive. It's not, it's something that we can totally fly with, but we might want to look at this when we're making a determination as a pilot, because lastly, we have to make a determination whether or not we as the pilot are safe with this item. Not to mention just all the other items, but we might pull this out, this risk assessment, and say, okay, is this a negligible and improbable or remote situation or occasional situation? And if it is and we're comfortable with it, then we can move on. But using this risk management tool as that last decision, if there's an inoperative piece of equipment, might be a good idea to use. Um, Pilot readiness, the I'm safe checklist is pretty standard: illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotions. Flying when you're sick is not a great idea. Medication, those medications have to be approved by the FAA. Stress is part of everybody's life, but we don't want to be flying in a situation where we're angry or upset with something, because it's going to redirect our attention. Alcohol, 8 hours is the minimum, but really 24 to 48 hours is probably more acceptable. And then fatigue, rest if you're tired. Making sure that you're getting plenty of rest is important. Even in a busy schedule, making sure that you are rested. Cat naps are not a bad idea. A 15-minute rest, it was before a flight, is not a terrible idea if you're feeling a little bit tired. And then your emotions, making sure that you postpone any issues or flights if you are emotionally unstable. So, and then what is the PAVE checklist? Well, the PAVE checklist is kind of another standard checklist that we do for ourselves prior to the takeoff, prior to the flight. The pilot, when we talk about pilot, we go back to the I'm safe. Aircraft, we're going to be using, our aviates and making sure that all of our inspections have been completed, making sure that all of our aircraft is completely ready for that flight. Environment, making sure that the weather is good, calling 1-800-WX-BRIEF if you have any questions. If you really have a question about that flight and you're kind of concerned, calling 1-800-WX-BRIEF is a great option, because you're actually talking to a human. It's not AI generated, not yet anyways, but you're actually talking to that person. They're walking you through the environment, and they might have some good some good tips on whether you should or shouldn't go. And then external pressures, those external pressures are coming from like your passengers and other people. Just remember those external pressures, make sure your passengers and the people you're flying with understand that flying is a privilege. It's not a right. It's not like a commercial flight, your American Airlines to San Francisco on a weekend. It's more of a privilege than it's not a right, it's a privilege. And then the 5 hazardous attitudes, you have impulsivity. And with impulsivity, you're kind of thinking like, do it quickly, like let's respond to this situation and get done quickly. Those things that when you're impulsive and your impulsive reactions, that could be, you can be doing that fast, but it also could be very dangerous. So the problem is we want to stop and think to yourself, not so fast, think first before you respond. Sometimes people who are under stress, either chronic or fatigue stress, can represent or expose or display impulsivity. That's a common response to stress, is impulsive actions, right? So they see something and they're kind of stressed out and they grab the yoke and they turn left really sharply. It's because their stress level is really high, maybe. So just making sure that we kind of watch that stress, right, with our students. Anti-authority, the rules don't apply to me. I can do whatever I want. I've been flying for a really long time. I know how to fly around here. Those are all kind of those things that are anti-authority. The antidote to this, how do you fix it? Follow the rules. They're probably there for a reason. And that's usually true. The rules are usually there because something has happened in the past. And so you have that anti-authority. Macho, you have that macho attitude. Let me show you what I can do. And then the antidote is taking chances is foolish. We have the potential to get into this when you're with your student or with you as yourself as a student. Maybe you're working on a maneuver or maybe you're working on a landing. I specifically remember a time I was working on my tail dragger endorsement, and we were out for a long time. We were doing these touch and goes out at Flaybob. And I wanted to get that 2-point landing down. the main gear landing down. And and it was, I was doing a bunch of patterns with my instructor, and he was like, I think we've seen enough. Like, let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back in a couple hours. Let's go get some lunch. And I was like, no, 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 I want to try again. I really felt like I can get this thing. And he was like, nope, we're shutting it down. And so he made that decision because he could see something that I didn't see. And that was that macho attitude of wanting to get something done. But I really needed to just kind of take a step back and then reevaluate my skill set. And you know what? We went to lunch, we came back, and my landings were much better after that because I was rested, and things were a lot more fun when I wasn't trying to force it happening. Invulnerability. It won't happen to me. These are things that, like, you just think you're Superman, like nothing's ever going to happen to me. But the antidote is it could happen to me. All of these things that we see, all of these accident investigations and videos, those are all potentially things that could happen to any of us as pilots. Even when we think like, oh, I would never get into that situation, or why didn't they just do this, or why didn't they do that? It's easy to say when you're sitting and looking at a video in an office, but if you are in that situation, your thought process might be different, and you are not invulnerable to these things. And then the last one we're going to talk about is resignation. What's the use? Not everything I do has no outcome. I can't control this situation. You're alone, and you're flying, and you're like, well, I guess this is it. This is the end, right? So that's not the actual thing. Or you get overwhelmed with instructions, right? And you're just like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. That's just kind of that like giving up resignation thing. The antidote is I'm not helpless. I can make a difference in this situation. So just kind of calm down and regain control and get assertive again. So we're looking at these five levels of danger that us as pilots have, and understand that if you look at these five levels of dangerousness, and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about here real fast, is that let's say that you have passivity, and then you have aggression. So P and A, and there's a straight line in between here. Okay. This resignation is your passivity. You are overly passive, right? You are overly passive. Aggression is that macho kind of attitude when we just talked about macho, and some of the other dangerous attitudes that are like like the other ones. And you have like invulnerability, right? Invulnerability might be here. And so we look at that. The perfect place you want to be is right here in the middle, which is assertiveness, right? And by being assertive, that's right in between passive and aggression. And that assertive attitude is going to keep you safe as a pilot, because not only are you able to identify a dangerous situation, but you're able to analyze that dangerous situation and make an assertive response to that. You're not going to be imposed by like your instructor. You're not going to be imposed by like, your friends who want to go flying. You're not going to be opposed by other outside environments. You're going to be assertive because you know what is safe, and your responses are going to be safe based on the principle. And I'm going to give you the principle right now that is going to keep you safe. You are going to fly based on principles, not emotions or feelings. So you're flying based on principles and not emotions. Okay. So principle-based flying. So what are some of the principles that we fly by, right? Our regulations. Regulations are one of the founding principles that we fly with, right? How we operate that aircraft safely, maybe proficiency and understanding that we're proficient in that aircraft, making sure that we have flight instruction. Did we ourselves receive enough flight instruction? Are we current as a pilot? These are all things that are based on principles and not feelings or emotions. Feelings or emotions are a little bit different. Feelings and emotions are, I'm ready to fly even though I haven't flown all day, or I haven't flown all month. These are emotional things. I've done this before and I know how to get out of this. Those are all emotional feelings. Those aren't principles. So making sure that we're flying based on principles, not emotions. And that's how you remain an assertive approach, an assertive pilot. So some of the phases of risk and teaching risk management. So understanding during this time, you're talking about a pre-solo, and pre-solo is you're going to have a discussion with your student. You're going to make sure that they are good to go. They're not having any emotional issues prior to that takeoff, and you're going to make sure they're ready for that pre-solo. Cross-country training, making sure that you're going over that cross-country with them and analyzing any potential risks, things like weather, any kind of traffic or air traffic controlling or airspace that they're going to be entering. And so we're going to go over that cross-country training. Risk during flight instruction. We're going to talk about our PAVE checklist, making sure that our pilot or our student is ready to fly. Is the student less proficient? And just understand that that student's going to be far less proficient, and they're going to have the controls most of the time. So we want to make sure that they're actually ready. The aircraft is CFI is often not directly managing or the maintenance, so we don't manage the maintenance, but we can also check all the maintenance to make sure it's there. The environment. Is it a busy practice area? And we want to make sure that our student is ready to fly in that busy practice area. And then external pressures, things like schedules, issues, pressures not canceled. So don't worry too much about those pressures and don't get forced into doing a flight lesson just because the weather's not looking good or because a student hasn't flown a lot. Make sure that you're staying safe with that student all the way through. Risk management for takeoffs and landings. Understand that when we're doing takeoffs and landings, we are low and slow and we're close to the ground. So we want to limit any large risky behavior while allowing the student to learn. So we want to make sure that we're there to basically limit the risk during that time period, but we want to make sure that they're still learning. So very low energy approaches, those cannot be tolerated. Takeoffs and landings happen quickly. And so the CFI, as a CFI, we must be extremely vigilant during this. So don't get distracted by like text or cell phone issues or anything else. We want to keep our distraction out. Realistic scenarios should be engaged, but not scenarios should not involve excessive pitch and roll. So of course, we want to give them realistic scenarios that are going to be not just your basic pattern, but we want to make sure that we don't use excessive pitch or roll. And always go around. If things don't look right, let's go ahead and execute that go around to make sure that we remain safe. And then emergency takeoffs, and there's no such thing as an emergency takeoff. There's only a emergency landing. So if things aren't right, if the conditions aren't correct, or if your student doesn't seem like they're ready, go ahead and taxi back around, have a discussion, and then when you're ready, then go ahead and take off. But there's no emergency takeoffs. Then when we talk about mid-air collision risks, we want to see and avoid scan. We know where all of that traffic areas are. We know where the busy traffic areas are located. And so we want to make sure we're maintaining that good visual separation. Clear turns, make sure that you're doing clearing turns, especially during your exam with your DPE. Make sure that you're doing those clearing turns. Poor visual scanning habits are going to be a concern. So make sure that you're doing that segmented visual scanning process so that you look throughout the entire area. Aircraft blind spots, we know that a high wing or a low wing are going to have blind spots. Climbs and descents, go ahead and take a moment to come down a little bit, push the nose down and look around. If you're on a crosswind and you're turning base, make sure you level your wings. Look at the 45 and the downwind to see if there's any other aircraft, and then make sure you're using good radio calls and use all of those radios appropriately. And then three-way exchange, making sure you're providing that three-way exchange really nice. The best way to exchange flight controls is between both parties is you have the flight controls, and then the other person says, I have the flight controls, and then you respond on a third time, you have the flight controls, and then visually confirm that that person actually has control. Lastly, before we get out of here, I want you to use your aeronautical decision-making and single pilot resources when you're alone. Okay, so when we're alone, we want to make sure we're using that single pilot resource. Perceive, process, and then perform. So that's a really quick, the 3 Ps are really quick and easy, but basically it's perceive the condition, process it, identify what you need to do, and then perform the action that needs to take place. So task prioritize, especially in the case of single pilot resource management, aviate, navigate, communicate. Fly that airplane the best you can, navigate where it needs to go, and then communicate any concerns. So often pilots get overwhelmed with all three of those, and instead of just flying and getting to a safe place, they make a decision to do all three, and that gets them in trouble. One of the best things you can do is just kind of, I know this is really simple and easy, but when you teach a child how to swim, you're really first only teaching them how to stay safe, right? So the first thing we do when you teach a child how to swim is we teach them how to float on their back. And the reason why you teach that is because in the event that they become overwhelmed by the conditions, all we do is say rotate, flip on your back, and float. And if they can do that, then they can stay safe for a period of time until somebody can come and help them. So the first thing you do when you teach a child how to swim is to float on their back, and that's so that they can revert to safety if they become overwhelmed in a situation. What's amazing is if you see like little 4-year-olds who know how to do that, you might see them in the pool with a bunch of kids and they're jumping around them, and the minute they feel overwhelmed, they have this automatic tendency to roll over and float on their back. It's kind of amazing because they're really young and they absorb all that information. I wish I could teach pilots how to do that. The minute they become overwhelmed with the situation, they immediately go into aviate and get themselves in a safe position. Unfortunately, as a result of investigation and some of the accidents, very rarely does that happen. The pilot just kind of wants to do everything as opposed to just get into a safe position and aviate. Complex avionics, those can be another concern. So making sure that you have a good understanding of complex avionics. Getting lost in menus and buttonology, that's a serious problem. Always dividing attention when performing these tasks. So just really making sure that you have a good understanding of your avionics. All right, so just a few takeaways. Number one, stay assertive in regards to your response to being safe. Maintain assertive actions. And the last thing I want to tell you is that we fly based on principles. We do not fly based on our feelings or emotions. We fly based on our principles. Are you proficient? Do you have enough time in that aircraft? Do you understand the environment around you? If all of those things are gathered, those are our principles. Are we flying based on regulations? Or do we have the regulations to support and back up our ability to fly? If all of those things are in place, then you are flying based on principles. If you are flying because you just want to really fly that day, or your friend really wants you to get to somewhere, or you're trying to impress somebody, that's flying because you're flying based on emotions and not principles. So stay assertive and keep that in mind. All right, you guys, we're going to be moving on to technical subjects next. We'll see you there.